Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV, and we kick off another 8th Air Force week with a look at the fate of the airmen who bailed out over Europe. Michael Lee Lanning is the author of the Blister Club, and links to his book can be found in the description below. And before I just bring him in, we have covered various aspects of the role on the ground. We discussed the escape route from the Netherlands to Paris a few weeks ago with Megan, and it's come up in various conversations about the bomb groups, about the protocol. But now we're going to focus in on exactly how it changed over the war, what were the procedures were, what some of the escape options were, and I will bring in my guest, Michael Lee Lanning, now. So good afternoon, Lee. How are you today?
Very well, thank you.
So you've written numerous books on numerous periods of history, non-fiction and also history as well. When did you decide to look at this aspect of escape and evasion, and why?
It's kind of a long story. In the early 1990s, I went back. I grew up in West Texas on a remote ranch, and I went back in the 90s to visit my parents' graves. Windswept, tumbleweeds. And as I was there standing above their headstones paying my respects, I noticed a man in the next plot over with a garden hoe, and he was hoeing out the weeds there. And I recognized the names on his tombstones because they were my parents' neighbors when I was growing up. Neighbors being relative, 5 miles was the nearest neighbor. I introduced myself, and I recognized his name because I'd heard that he was a World War II aviation airman veteran, B-17 crewman. And I got to talking to him, and I said, "How many missions did you have?" And he said, "Well, I guess none, because I got shot down on my first mission." And I said, "What happened?" He said, "Well, I walked out." And that made an impression, but I put it in the back of my mind because I'm no aviation expert. I did not think about writing a book about aviation until I was doing a book on the court-martial of Jackie Robinson, the American baseball player that when he was in the Army, he was court-martialed for not going back to the back of the bus. And I did a book on him, but while I was doing the research, I stumbled upon 52 boxes, 43,000 pages of after-action reports of American aviators shot down over Europe who escaped and evaded. I started going through them, and it was just an amazing story. They've been available, but it's one of those things where writers usually don't have enough information. In this case, there was just too much information. But the more I read, the more I determined how to kind of synthesize it and get it down. And it was a story that was interesting and needed to be told.
Well, thank you. And I think a lot of people watching, myself included, if we take the movies, and we shouldn't ever take movies as an example of history, but the movies seem to suggest that airmen make it up as they go along. They kind of just find themselves wherever they are, in Germany, in France, or even in the Far East, and they just kind of improvise and get together. Those classic movies, there's the one with Ronald Reagan, Desperate Journey in World War II, and The Great Escape and what have you. But actually, there was a real science behind it. You know, it maybe not at the beginning of the war, but as the war evolved on, and I suppose it's because pilots and air crews were an expensive commodity. They took a lot of training to get them into the air. Aircraft were, I suppose, disposable, but air crew weren't. So the idea was to try and bring some of them back if they were shot down, to get them back so they can be of use again. So I've got a little bit, some images today, folks, PowerPoints. I put it together today. We've got some maps and these questions we will do as we go along. So feel free to fire away with your questions. We have quite one already saying, does this cover the US Army Air Force airmen who flew with the RAF squadron? Well, I can ask Lee that in a minute. There was a lot of overlap because the same information was going to come in from OSS and MI9. I'll let Lee explain that as we go on. But there's a kind of a separation between the 8th Air Force and the RAF, but then there's this overlap as well. But basically, get the ball rolling, Lee, and kind of tell us, where was the USA at the beginning of the war in terms of what preparations they had for aircrew to be shot down? Was there any kind of previous doctrine they were working from, or was it all kind of started from scratch as war declared?
Well, they received in their training some very basic things about parachuting. And then they were given some very, very small amount of information on what to do when they got on the ground. And it was kind of a mixed message. You didn't want to train people talking about when you get shot down, because you want to make them convinced that they're not going to get shot down. So you kind of give them enough information to help them, but not enough to hurt the morale of the troops as well. And as far as the question that you just received, of course, some Americans flew with the RAF before the Americans got into war. But once we got in it, there were a couple of joint missions, a couple of Americans that flew RAF planes, but by the mid 1942, the Americans were flying. But of course, by that time, you Brits had already been fighting the war for 3 years and doing a pretty good job. And some of our leaders were smart enough to pay attention to what our allies had done. And when the 8th Air Force came in and General Spaatz saw what MI9 was doing to get the British airmen to try to get their escape, he signed people to overwatch them and to learn for them and to set up what was called MISX, Military Intelligence Service X, which oversaw not only the escape and evasion of American aviators, but also sent items through the Red Cross to American airmen in the stalags, the prison camps in Germany, to aid their escape, although I don't cover that in the book.
Well, take us through the formation of that, because one of the things we're going to be discussing later in the week with Robin Pryor is the always debated American strategic bombing policy, British Commonwealth strategic bombing policy, which was right, which was wrong, daylight, nighttime. And there's this suggestion, and we're not going to go down that rabbit hole today in this show, that there's some friction between the nations in their ideas about what should be done. Churchill thinks certain things, Bomber Harris. But what you're saying is, in terms of escape and evasion, there is right from the outset, because as you said there, the RAF have been flying over Europe from 1939 onwards, there is a sense of the two nations, and Canada as well, we must include, working together. So tell us more about the creation of this and who was involved in it and what the initial ideas were.
It's probably one of the better examples of Allied cooperation during the war. MI9 and MISX personnel worked very closely, exchanged reports without being edited, and they really had a very specific mission that both of them agreed with. And some of the stories that I have, American airmen would run into a British airman or Australian, Canadian, Polish, and they joined and made the escape together. So it truly was a united effort. I'm working on a present book on General Eisenhower, and see how the Allied problems that you talk about and the frictions that went on, it really wasn't there with the MI9 and MIX.
Well, that's good to know, because I mean, friction sells books, of course, but in fact, cooperation is the name of the game here. Because, and it's going to bring us up the escape lines. Because the other thing that you need to get your airmen back is you need to have something in occupied Europe to deal with them. Yes, you can arm the airmen with some skills, and we'll talk about some of the escape kit later on, because I know that's a big part of your book, and people know about the silk maps and things like that. But we can get that later. But you've also got to have a network within occupied Europe. So we've talked previously on World War II TV about resistance networks. We've talked about some of the escape lines, but from the documents you found, what was done to work on what already existed in Europe, and what was done to set up new lines in Europe, and this organization, and we get to the OSS and MI9. So tell us more about this setting up of the lines themselves.
The lines themselves were mostly established by MI9. There were 3 primary lines, but over time, during the entire war, there were probably as many as 50. And the reason there were so many is that they were frequently penetrated by the Gestapo, or if they captured one, they had means of finding out where the other people were, and some of the lines would come and go. The principal lines was the Sherborne line, which was a direct route from northern France over to England, and then the O'Leary line that went from basically northern France all the way down to Spain, and the Comet line that went from the Netherlands and Belgium into Spain. But the people that ran the lines, the people that were in the lines, the worst thing you could do was know more than you have to. You only need to know the next person you needed to hand them off to, because there was a tremendous danger and a tremendous fear, rightfully so, by the resistance people that ran the lines, the helpers. So they had to be very careful. Interesting on the lines, the first thing the helpers did when they get an American aviator or Allied aviator came in their hands was they wanted to prove that it really was a good guy, because the Germans would put in people to try to penetrate and find them. And the Gestapo and the Germans were pretty successful in all these lines, ending them. And the problem was, if you were caught, you were probably tortured for information and then executed. So there wasn't much hope if you were on one of the helpers and you got caught.
Yeah, we can touch on that later on. So you said earlier on about this, the complicated deal with the fact that you don't want to tell these young airmen who've just arrived from wherever they've arrived from in the USA. They're from Kansas, they're from California, they're from Texas, and they're joining a bomb crew. They already know the dangers of enemy flak and enemy fighters, but now there's this danger of being shot down and finding yourselves in occupied territory. So, as you said there, you want to prepare these men for that eventuality, but without worrying them at the same time. So key to that, and this is going back to the RAF, is basing it on the experiences of guys who have made it home. So you want to get across to people, look, you can do this because this guy did this 2 years ago. And while you're talking, I'll let you answer that in a minute. I'm going to refer to these photos we had on a show with Phil Brazier a few weeks ago about the bomb group he studied. And this is the picture of inside the facilities in England, where these mess areas and things had these maps up on the wall. They had information about what to look for in terms of Swedish ships and phrasebooks and things like that. So how was the process set up? So I'm an 8th Air Force guy. I'm 19 years old. I've arrived in England. I've joined a unit and I'm a waist gunner. What preparation do I get when I arrive in England? And did it change as the war went on is key as well.
In addition to flying missions, there was constant training in the air and both on the ground. Before missions, they received, of course, the mission briefing that we see in all the movies in the tent, and they getting the screen and seeing where they're going. But they were issued, before they got on their planes, an escape kit, which basically had a little bit of food, a little bit of a map, a compass, and what the basic needs for a couple of days. They also received what they called a purse, which I always thought was interesting. I never could pin down as to exactly name it the purse. Didn't seem very masculine for an airman, but they were issued a purse, and in the purse was money and additional assistance to help them get out. The money, obviously, to pay their helpers. The purses were color-coded. In other words, if you were going on a mission over northern France, it might be one color, where if you were going into Belgium, it would be another color, so it would have the correct kind of maps and the correct kind of money in it. But we talk about these briefings, and interestingly, with all the reports, 43,000 pages of reports that I read, I can only think of a couple where the airman said, I went on that mission thinking I was going to die or I was going to get shot down. Every one of them says, wow, I got shot down. I was really surprised. And
wow.
They really shouldn't have been, because of the large percentage of them did get shot down.
Right. So that's good to know. So as we talked about at the beginning, the system does evolve as the war goes on. So we've got those RAF pilots and other aviators. There's Poles and there's French and what have you, who've managed to get to the UK in 1940. Their experiences are kind of then funneled through MI9. MI9 then funnels it through. So it's a constant updating of procedures, because as you said there, the lines that they're going into are being broken by the Gestapo. There's changes all the time. So how is the information updated? Where is the central kind of database of information kept, and how is that relayed to the various bomb groups and fighter groups around the UK, if we use the 8th Air Force as an example?
Well, both of them had their headquarters there in London, where they debriefed the people that came out. There was no central headquarters for any of the lines, because that was strictly get them in trouble. There were some leaders that helped them set up. A few of them survived. And sometimes the French resistance knew the lines, but they didn't exactly. It wasn't A to B. Sometimes you had to go to C and maybe to D to come back to A to make the escape work.
Great. So I'm going to put the escape lines up there again. The first thing before even getting on the ground, the other thing we've got to deal with is the getting out of the aircraft. So you talked about the escape kits they were issued with, and I said that was evolved, and you had the color codes and like that. But we would have, when we board a flight now ourselves to go anywhere, the air crew will tell us what the escape procedures are, things like that. I mean, obviously the 8th Air Force is using all different types of aircraft. There's B-17s, B-24s in the bomber force, then you've got all the fighters and P-38s and P-51s and what have you. The parachutes aren't the same. I found that when I was doing a bit of research, the parachutes are very interesting. This, by the way, is a graphic I found on my hard drive, how to bail out from the B-17, because I'll let Lee explain more, each person's position in the aircraft means they have a different exit and a different type of parachute. Do you want to explain a bit more about that, Lee?
Yes, because some of the positions in the aircraft, it was difficult to have the parachute on, so you actually had to put it on once the pilot rang the bell or gave a verbal order to evacuate the plane. And I'll tell you, as a parachutist in the U.S. Army, that I spent several years with airborne units, over 40 jumps out of airplanes of various types. It's frightful. All you have to do though is be brave for a second, and then gravity takes over. But in reading the reports, these guys are in a plane with a very small amount of aluminum between them and bullets and rockets coming in. Generally, nearly every plane they jumped out of was on fire. There's usually blood on the floor from their crewmen that have been wounded. But they did drill, and if an order's given to jump, this is where you go, and this is the door that you jump out of. Frequently, if you were the right door gunner, you made sure the left door gunner got out, or the other way around. So you watch for each other. There's no real statistics on what position was easier or harder to get out. In some cases, I know one case I read where a plane blew up in the air. Only the tail gunner survived because he was blown out and happened to have his chute on, and all the rest died at that time. Some cases, the parachute didn't work, or the person was so frightened that they never pulled the ripcord. Wow.
And I'm assuming there's no two stories that are the similar in this, same in this, in that every accident's maybe not the right word, but every incident of an aircraft being hit, it depends what altitude it's at, it depends whether it's over land or over sea, it depends whether it's an engine on fire, whether it's the fuselage that's been hit, it depends whether the pilot's in control or not in control. Is it diving? Is it going level? Is it losing speed? What does these documents that you found there? What sort of reports are there in there? I mean, are there lots and lots of individual stories of what these aircrew went through?
Every story is different, and every story is the same. Basically, the plane got hit. I jumped out, landed on the ground, ran, hid in a haystack, then started walking, and then made contact with the resistance. But every one of them has got a different story about I hid in a haystack until a dog ran me out because he thought it was his haystack, or landed in a certain area he had to get out of, or where they hid, or how they hid. Most frightening aspects I think to think of is most of them had only a few hours of actually parachute training, and they jumped from those planes obviously on fire. They didn't have much choice, but the stories they were told in their training to wait till they got down to 5,000 to 10,000 feet to pull the ripcord. And because that would give less time for the Germans to spot them and less time to be shot at in the air. But generally, they would say, I was taught that, but as soon as I got out of the plane, I pulled the ripcord. And I certainly can't blame them for that. But like I said, every story is different, 43,000, but there's so many similarities in them. And but it forms a very unique idea of these airmen being individuals who the ones who escaped, were very brave and very lucky at the same time.
Well, I want to expand on that, because luck obviously has an enormous role in this, because, as you said there, that you don't have any statistics about which is the safest area of the aircraft or the unsafest area. There is obviously, though, a protocol to follow. And that's why I'm going to get down on that, because the 8th Air Force is flying over Europe in 42. It's still flying over Europe in 45. Was the basic what you do on the ground if you're an airman, was the procedure pretty much the same in 45 as it was in 42, or did it drastically evolve as technology changed and the situation in Europe changed?
The initial instructions was get on the ground, hide your parachute, and get as far away from the parachute and the plane if it come down close to you, and get away from it. Walk at night. When you finally decided to approach the villagers, go not to a very wealthy house or a very poor house. They would be more likely to turn you in. Go to a kind of a middle-level home. Explain you were American. Try to go to only one person, so you're limiting the people that know who you are. identify yourself. Once that contact was made, the reports generally stop with the words, and then my journey was arranged. And that's when the report starts, when they go into the lines. And lots of times it's not there. Some of the reports it is there, but 80% of the reports end, and then my journey was arranged. So the rest of the reports come out from the ones that did not have the assistance.
Mm. And you sent me this image of the phrase book there, and I found another one there. I mean, these are specifically the phrase card issued to these kind of people because it contains exactly what you need. Is it, I need civilian clothes, which way is the enemy? They're not telling you how to engage in a conversation about, hey, that's a nice flower bed there, and how old's your daughter? It's all about very practical information. So the phrase, obviously the phrasing has all been worked out. They know that if you're flying over France, you need French speaker. If you're flying over Germany, perhaps you need German language. But this experience of evolving, going and speaking to people in the kind of mid-level house, that's obviously based on experience. Is that the experience that people were bringing back in 1940, the early RAF escapers?
Yeah, these cards, both the Americans called these cards pointy-talkie cards.
Pointy-talkie, yeah.
Probably the British did too, and they exchanged. An advantage too, not only to the phrase cards, is remembering in the 1930s, particularly in America, where we are a nation of immigrants. And in the 30s, we still had many of our aviators were first generation Germans, Polish, French, so Italian. So they spoke the language. These guys certainly had an advantage, but there's some that were long term. Many of them spoke nothing but English. So the pointy-talkie cards helped them make that initial contact.
Brilliant stuff. And I say, did it evolve as the war went on? I mean, the escape. Let's go back to the escape gear because people find that really fascinating. Because the RAF again had some gadgets that the U.S. Army Air Force didn't have, but there were shared things as well. Run us through some of the other bits of useful equipment. Because I know, tell us about the photos, for example, in that they had these crew photos that could be trimmed down to use for documents. Let's talk about the photos. Who came up with that idea, and how widespread was that?
It originally with the Brits, but the Americans had it from the beginning, but they didn't have good intelligence on what these pictures should really look like. Initially, a lot of them were too large or printed on the wrong side of paper. The French resistance and helpers knew this and had their own photography capabilities. So most of the ID cards that were faked where the photos were used initially made in France or Belgium. Later, when this information got back from escapees, they learned more what these photos should look like, and they adapted to them. It's interesting what we should put in here about the escape kits and pack purses, including the pictures, is a good percentage, I would say well over a fourth of the airmen, when they ask about how good was your escape kit, he said, well, I left it on the plane. Or the purse said, well, it was in the pocket of my flight suit, but it must have fallen out. Because when the plane is burning, shells are still coming in, blood on the floor, a lot of them just simply forgot it. And they tried to get them to always, fix it inside the zipper of their flight suit, but some of them still didn't. And I was just surprised by the number that said they didn't have one.
Well, that brings us back to the many things that are running through your mind when your aircraft has been hit. You're thinking about your friends that, as you said, they may be dead or dying. You're thinking about the fact you're however many thousand feet above the ground. You're thinking about your parachute, getting that on and that opening. I suppose your escape gear is fairly low down the list. And I can understand why a quarter of them or so didn't end up having their escape gear. But it does show the inventiveness of these ideas coming up. We've got an image on the screen there of one of the silk escape maps. And these things are even being reproduced these days, folks. You can go online and buy a brand new copy of these things. And these are brilliantly inventive. If you don't know what they are, folks, these silk maps, because it's printed on silk, you can screw it up into a little ball. You can hide it in the collar. You can hide it in your boot, hide it in your underwear. And it's waterproof and it can roll out, and they're about 3 foot by 3 foot, something like that. They're fairly big, and there's ones of France and Germany and what have you. They're an important asset, and you can even wear them as like a scarf around your neck. So that's the familiar bit of equipment people are often aware of. But any other of the gadgets that you think were really, really fascinating?
Initially, the maps came in paper, And found out real quick that when you're out in the woods in the rain, they didn't last long. And that's when some of the first people came back and they advised them, and they were printed on a silk-like material. And like you said, you can still find them on eBay today.
Yeah, no, brilliant stuff. So you've looked at these reports. What's the learning curve? You've studied the documents. You've seen that you said that there isn't, some of the data doesn't exist. But as a historian looking at it, what were the improvements made during the war? What does the data tell us about the chances of getting back? Did it get better? Did it get worse as the war went on? Were there particular countries where your chance of getting back was higher or lower? Run us through some of the things that you discovered.
Once again, the Americans had the advantage of the British experience. So a lot of the improvements have been made. Improvements in the maps, the photographs, and just the general idea of to the people that no matter what happens, there's still a chance. You can imagine a flight of B-17s flying out, half of them coming back, half of them they know are missing, and then a month later, 2 months later, while the surviving pilots are sitting in the officers' club or the enlisted club back in the countryside of England, in walks one of the guys that got shot down 3 months ago. So it was tremendous morale boost to see that happen. The improvements that went along, they were pretty good, pretty standard, like I said, by the time the Americans got them. And then what finally, I guess the biggest change was once the D-Day invasion came in, that was the first question that the French always, or French, Belgium, and Dutch always asked the downed aviators, when are you coming? When is the invasion going to happen? And once the invasion did occur, then mostly the lines were pretty well shut down. First of all, they'd been penetrated a lot, but mostly there wasn't any need to get anybody to Spain anymore, because everybody knew that Patton's army and Montgomery's army were going to keep penetrating, and all you had to do was hide till they got there. And the French hit them in various places, and they just waited to come there. The longest time, there were a couple of guys in Belgium, excuse me, from the 15th Air Force, that was something like 200 days that they hid out before they were liberated.
Yeah, and that was a big camp near Paris somewhere, was there? We're full of RAF evaders, and they were told to wait for D-Day. So again, this is born out of policy. It was taking a long time to get these aviators back via the escape routes. Although they were successful, it was in many cases it was fraught with potential dangers. The Gestapo were in danger of breaking these lines, and then you have local people getting swept up in it. So in the end, the policy kind of changed to staying where you can then be swept up by the liberation. So let's go back to the subject of the 8th Air Force and the Army Air Force and the changes in technology. So run us through some other things that you discovered in the research of the book that you'd like to share with the audience.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
Run us through some of the other things you discovered in the documents that you'd like to share with the audience today.
Well, like I said, there's just so many individual instances that are just fascinating. The stories just go on and on. One of my favorite stories was that the Americans were taught, when you get shot down, if you're shot down, do not go to Paris. That's the biggest concentration of Germans and the biggest chance of getting caught. Nearly every American hit the ground. Where did they head? They headed for Paris, because that's where they'd heard, and they kind of wanted to see it. One of them, when they got there were people that would hide them and give them the clothes. The one American went decided he'd be a tourist while he was in Paris. He went to Napoleon's tomb, and while he's there looking at the tomb, a German soldier walked up behind him, tapped him on the shoulder, and he said, I thought, well, here I'm heading for the Staliks now. The German soldier said, would you please hold my rifle while I take a picture? And the American aviator held his rifle while he took the picture. In another case, an American was shot down in a village in northern France. The Germans came on motorcycles and trucks and hit out, and he was running from them, literally running from them. He came to a house, ran through the house, and heard a motorcycle come to the front. He ran to the backyard, waited till the German came around to the backyard, ran back to the house, stole the German's motorcycle, and headed out across the country. I think that's probably where the instance in the movie The Great Escape, where Steve McQueen makes his escape, probably where the author came with that story from. But there's
the other thing I want to press you about is the evading in your uniform and evading in civilian clothing, because it does change the game as far as how the Germans perceive this. So what was the official policy of the US Army Air Force? Was it to get civilian clothing? How did they advise on this? Because certainly when the infamous commando order was issued by Hitler, which we've talked about on this channel numerous times, and it said that anybody found out behind the lines, not in military uniform, can be treated as a spy, as a terrorist. What was the official policy? Was it to try and blend in, and did it change? Because this is where you're into the kind of the Geneva Convention and the rules of war. And again, what does the documentation that you examine tell us?
They were advised to seek civilian clothing as quickly as possible. Generally, it was considered if they kept their dog tags on, that would be considered enough to prevent them from being the helpers. If they were caught, it was at the end. If the airmen were lost, they were sent to the stockades. Only a few instances, like in Schweinfurt, were the airmen beaten to death by the civilians that had just been bombed. Most cases, they were treated fairly well by the Germans once they were caught. It was kind of a chivalry between the German aviators and the American aviators. The aviation POW camps were limited to aviators. It wasn't the other people brought in. They were run by the Luftwaffe. So there was fairly good there. Generally, the first thing that the captured people were told, the German soldier would tell the airman, your war is over, and they'd be taken off. Not that anybody wanted to be captured, but it was not the worst thing that could happen.
No, thank you for that. And it brings up the point as well as a difference between escape and evasion, because we had the British historian Guy Walters on a couple of years ago now, talking about in Britain, we have this idea that it was certainly the British officer's duty to try and escape. Now, I'm talking particularly about if you've been captured and you're in a prisoner of war camp or you're in some kind of transit camp, it is your duty to escape. And he is determined in his searching of the British archives, there is no such order compelling officers or anybody to actually try and escape for a prisoner of war camp. To evade capture, yes, you're not supposed to get captured. You should do everything you can to avoid surrendering or being captured. But actually escaping from a prisoner of war camp is not a duty. There may be some kind of boys' code that you're expected to escape, but there's nothing written down. What do the American archives say about any policies in regards to this? Because you're the airman, you've landed in France, you're evading capture. But what happens if you do get picked up by the local gendarmerie or the Germans? What are you still supposed to escape, or is it down to the individual what they're supposed to do? What do the documents tell us?
The American Code of Conduct does say you will make every effort to escape once you're captured. Of course, the chance of being escaping from the Stalags that were very deep into German territory were pretty remote, and we've seen the stories in the movies and all that of what was attempted. MISX did give assistance to that as well, although everything I focused on were the evaders on the ground. I think maybe we should go back and take the whole process.
Let's go through.
You've got a 19, 20-year-old enlisted men, 21, 22, 23-year-old pilots and crew. They take that plane off from somewhere in England. They're shot out down in Belgium or France. They jump from the plane that's burning. They hit the ground. They hide their chute. Hopefully they find some help. And then they start walking. And this is where they get the name Blister Club, is because they walk. But they didn't walk all the way. It was organized that sometimes once they got their ID, they would get on trains. Sometimes they were taken on farm wagons, and they started heading south. And if they were fortunate enough, they'd finally get down to the Pyrenees after a month, 2 months of walking and transportation. They had to cross the Pyrenees Mountains, snow-covered, hardship. They had found guides that helped take them over, and they got into Spain. But once they got into Spain, they weren't really safe yet, because if we remember back to the Spanish Revolution, Franco, who won, was supported by the Germans. Although Spain was neutral, they certainly wanted to maintain a good relationship with their German friends. So sometimes the Spanish would turn them back to the Germans. So the best thing they could do was quickly get to an American consulate, who then moved them to British-controlled Gibraltar, got on a plane, got them back to England and get them back to England as soon as possible, and then get them to MIX so they could be debriefed. And the first thing in that debriefing was you were called in and you had to prove that you were who you claimed. Because the MISX was just as suspicious of the Germans trying to penetrate their ideas as the resistance. So once they proved, usually somebody in their unit came, and actually the sworn statements are in the files saying Joe is Joe, then you were debriefed. The first thing I wanted to know was what happened to the other 9 crewmen. And he said, well, crewman A I saw was shot and killed aboard. All the rest jumped, but I didn't see but 3 parachutes on the ground, and I didn't see anybody else. Or possibly I reunited with 4 others. We separated, and they tried to figure out who was missing, who was dead, and who was captured. So that was the first thing. Then they were questioned about how the purse had worked, whether it was good, the escape kit had worked. And then the most important part was, what did you see during your escape? Intelligence. The fellow said, well, when I was walking by Orly, I saw an air base with a lot of new looking airplanes. Some of the first reports of the V1 and V2 rockets were not from any people seeing them, but from hearing about them from French who had been made to work on the facility. Some of the first accounts of the Holocaust, the execution of Jews, came from stories that the E&E folks heard, and they brought that information back. And then finally, they wrote a report on who had helped them. Generally, they didn't know any more than a fellow named Francois, and Francois probably wasn't his name, but he would say a tall Frenchman with glasses and a mustache that lived here certainly helped. And this was to help identify them so they could pay them some benefits after the war was over. So after all that process, the people were not sent back into combat. That's the reason my friend that I met in the cemetery in Texas, they were sent either to training places back in the United States or in England. They were afraid if they were sent back and shot down again, they might be questioned and might reveal some of the ideas of how they escaped. This stopped after D-Day because the advancing American and British forces overtook any intelligence value that a shot down person could do. The first person to get permission to rejoin it was Chuck Yeager, the eventual fighter pilot, or was a fighter pilot, ace from World War II in Korea. And he was the first to be able to go back and fly missions again.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned Chuck Yeager because he came up in the sidebar 10 minutes ago, because his story is in your book. So for those who don't know, if you want to just briefly tell his escape story, because typical of everything in that guy's incredible career, it was an amazing story. Any one of the things in his career would make it a movie, but when you add his entire life together, it's a multi-part series on TV. But run us through Chuck Yeager's escape story or evasion story.
Yeah, amazing story. He walked over the Pyrenees Mountains. His escape story is a wonderful story. Interestingly, though, I get emails and reviews of people about it. I had a very nasty email from a gentleman that said, "Why didn't I cover more on Chuck Yeager? He's a true hero." And all I could write back is, "Yes, he is a true hero, but the book is not about Chuck Yeager. It's about the people, the Blister Club." And he did no more or no less than the other members and deserved no more attention than they got.
That's a fair enough response there. Any other of these, the accounts you found, any other stories that stand out that you want to share with us today?
It's interesting that their helpers range from children to old people. They're interesting, like I said, nearly every escapee has a story of hiding in a haystack, some hid in the attics of buildings. One was actually put in the barn and covered with manure because the Germans were almost there. His was probably the hardest hide space. Some of them picked up when they were walking down the road. They pick up, the French would provide them a cane pole, fishing pole, and they put it over their shoulder and act like they were going fishing. Some stole boats and went on the canals. Some of them rode in the few French vehicles that were available. Doctors in particular were always helpful and helped them make their transport. Very interesting stories about being in the train stations, trying to be very careful and not going to sleep in a rail car because they were afraid that they might stalk in their sleep and they'd speak English and be caught. They talked about the most common item that they used when they were actually confronted was they would fake being a deaf mute. They would only make hand motions and try to do that. And I thought, boy, that seems like the Germans would pick that up. But when you talk about the few thousand Americans that actually escaped and the large number of roads, it's just like if you go out to your building today and stumble into somebody and he acts like he can't hear, you're not going to think he's a German or Soviet spy. You're just going to think he's somebody that can't hear or talk.
Yeah, no, definitely. And you talked about the numbers there, because the preface of your book explains. I mean, 10,000 or so American aircraft shot down in World War II, and 30,000 airmen found themselves on the ground, surviving that. But is it 3,000 that managed to get their way back? 10%? Is that right?
That's correct. Although the number is a little skewed. In that 3,000 number are some paratroopers from the 101st and 82nd Airborne that jumped during D-Day that were cut off, and some of them were actually captured briefly, and they came back. So some of those numbers are those. There's also these people. It's interesting that the infantry soldiers from the Airborne, when they came back, they were debriefed and sent back to their units and went right back into the war. And several people that I did the interview for, I found out later, were actually killed in the war later. But most, if you were a successful airman escapee, you survived the war.
I mean, that's interesting, because when you were saying that, I was thinking about some of the paratroopers I met. I mean, I'm thinking about Jack Schlegel of the 508th in Normandy. He escaped and went back into combat and was fighting in Market Garden in Germany. But he just, he was taken as far as a transit camp. I think he was taken as far as Germany and was allowed to. It's a long story, but he was allowed to escape Jack Schlegel was German extraction, so he spoke perfect German. And a German doctor at the camp felt sorry for him because he was only 19 years old, and kind of gave him a pass to walk out the camp. And he walked out and made his way back to Normandy. And he jumped again. He jumped in September in Market Garden. So the policy between the paratroopers and the aircrew obviously wasn't consistent, which was interesting. But going back to the policy thing about the code of honor, we had a question earlier from David Levine watching about this, this policy of you're meant to try and evade capture, you're meant to try and get back. What was that policy ever questioned? Did anyone think? Were there inquiries saying, once you've been shot down, you don't have to escape? Was there any reaction to that?
Well, there was some controversy about damaged planes that flew to Sweden or Switzerland, that the pilots should have probably tried to bring them back, or whether or not they were just trying to sit out the rest of the war. In Sweden, they were talked about some of them snow skiing instead of fighting. But in Switzerland, they were actually treated more as prisoners than they were anything else, because they also had to maintain their relationship with the Germans. But rare cases. Most of them did their best. I think every one of them determined to try to escape. We haven't mentioned that a lot of these 20-something thousand people that didn't hit the ground, or 30,000, didn't hit it in good shape. They were either had burns from the plane, or a broken limb, or were wounded. So their only means was not to escape. There are a few instances, and some of the planes actually put their wounded people out before the plane kept trying to go, because they knew the person would not survive without medical attention. And even if that medical attention came from a German doctor, it would be just as successful.
That's a very good point to mention. Of this 10%, you say a great proportion of those guys who had made it to the ground, as you say, were wounded or with broken bone, or saying couldn't possibly evade anyway. So that makes that figure of 10% all the more remarkable. So again, in the archives, because when you search the internet now, folks, the current serving military have all sorts of escape and evasion ideas and apparatus and equipment, and the kits have got more sophisticated and over the years. Was the archives you studied, was there any view to this information being used in the future, or was it kind of always seen as a short term, it's just to bring our guys back now? Or was there long-term thinking about this evolving into future wars and things like that? Was there an intention of this being a long-term program of lesson learning?
Yes. After the war, well, actually, before the war was over, they tried to set up survival schools for pilots shot down. So but that was in the Pacific. And of course, there wasn't any real escape and evasion in the Pacific because, first of all, you were Anglo and an Asian world, and there was mostly water instead of land. But after the war, the military did set up an E&E school that's now at Fairchild Air Force Base in Washington State. And it's much, much more complete than the few hours that the World War II aviator received. This is about a 3-week-long course where they actually practice survival skills in the woods. And from pilots I've talked to, it's probably the toughest school the Air Force has to go through.
No, definitely. Well, we've got a question from Sean, a comment/question from Sean Brennan. The documentation that you've studied, I think you said this yourself, Lee, it has a bias for those who actually escaped, because obviously if you didn't get back, you didn't file a report, you weren't able to be part of the system to analyze it. So the guys who did make their way back, is there anything that any consistent thing that they said that they wish they'd known? Or, I mean, obviously they are introducing these improvements as the war goes on, but was there anything you discovered that in 43 they always said this, or in 44 they wished they'd said this? Was there anything that was constant about the reaction of these guys who made it back home?
The most common item in the reports, the most repeated item, is I wish I had taken my Army shoes with me.
Right.
Because when they hit the ground, a lot of them did, but the ones that didn't, all they had was their heavy aviation boot. And what they did, they would cut them down to try to look like a civilian boot so they wouldn't be readily identified. But they were very uncomfortable for walking. They were primarily to keep you warm in the air. And the Army shoe was what a lot of them took. Some of them tied the Army shoes to their parachute as soon as they got on the airplane. And the most common thing I said was, gosh, I wish I'd have taken my shoes.
Which brings us, of course, to the title of the book, The Blister Club, because if you're trying to evade and capture, being able to move comfortably on your feet is key to that. And as you said earlier, the distances some of these guys covered, okay, there was trains and there was vehicles and buses, but you still have to do a hell of a lot of it on your feet. Yeah, the foot sloggers, as I think they called them in The Great Escape, when Richard Attenborough was explaining to those what's going to happen. I think it's the foot sloggers. So having good footwear is key to it. So going back to the purpose of the book and the archives there, any other conclusions you drew from this? That what do you think should have been incorporated that wasn't? In your chance to look at these documents with the benefit of 70 years plus years hindsight, anything that you think where this system should have been better or could have been better?
Well, yeah, the training could have been more. But like I said, when we first started, there was a fine line of what are you doing that's going to hurt morale and what's going to help morale. But it's there. It's amazing that these documents still preserve, because MI6 destroyed all their copies. They thought they destroyed all their copies at the end of the war. But these were copies, I don't know, I think they were from the files that came back from England and not the ones that came back to MI6 headquarters in Virginia. And this strictly is the way they didn't want any names revealed or anything that might hurt anybody. And I might say before we run out of time, some of your listeners, especially there in the UK, there's probably a book just like my Blister Club. For the Blister Club is a word the Americans adopted from the Brits to begin with. But the British did the same reports, almost identical. The Americans adopted theirs. So somewhere deep in the archives there in Great Britain is probably the files that were the debriefing of the British aviators. So somebody that's looking for a book subject, there's something for them to look for.
There probably is. I mean, just to remind folks, in May, we're doing an RAF week, and one of the presenters we have coming on is going to talk about the Shelburne line, because he's written a book about that. So he's going to talk about the particular route that ends up going through Brittany. I was there myself in October last year and saw the beach, Bonaparte Beach, where some of these people were rescued. But in terms of the work from the US Air Force point of view, these pages and pages of documents, anything else that you think that we should talk about before we open up to questions that we haven't already covered?
I think we're pretty well covered. I'd welcome some questions.
Okay, so if we've got any questions, we can do that. I'll think of something to get the ball rolling, and then I'll welcome your questions, folks. So the chances of getting back, as I said, that you're not going back to flying again, but you can be used in instructors and things like that. Anything else that these people did they go on war bonds drives? Were they used to kind of increase public morale at all, or were they kind of kept secret because they didn't want the information to get out too much about the escape procedures?
pretty much all the above. They
All
were
of the above.
instructors, administrative positions, and it was something they were told very quick. They signed, everyone signed a document. I didn't point that out. In each file for each individual was a document saying that they would not talk about to anybody about what had occurred.
Right, brilliant. Well, the first question from Sean is, did the escort fighter pilots get the same briefing and kits, or was their information slightly different? Because obviously maybe the altitude is slightly different to what they're doing, but was it broadly the same instructions, or did they get anything specific?
They got the same kits and the same purses. Their procedures, of course, of exiting an aircraft, which was covered no matter how many times, was different, obviously, than the bombers. But in reading the report, once the people got on the ground, you couldn't tell any difference whether the fellow was airman, was a fighter pilot, or a crewman on a bomber.
And do you know whether there's any difference in the survival rates? Were you more likely to survive as a fighter pilot or a bomber, a crewman, or is there nothing in the information to kind of indicate that?
There's no information as such. I think probably, obviously, a lot more bomber pilots because there's 10-man crew compared to a one-man crew on the fighter planes. But the fighter planes generally had a more tendency to be destroyed in the air than to be able to, the bombers be able to keep at least enough altitude to get the crew out.
That makes sense. Another question from David Levine. Does your book cover the risk of the civilians that help the airmen?
Yes, we'll go for the helpers. All of them, the resistance helped towards the end of the war when the aviators joined the resistance before the people from D-Day came up. But before then, the civilian helpers, their lives were in danger. They put their life on the line, and often their family's life on the line to do it. They did see some reparations at the end of the war for their help. I read one report where a fellow filed that said, I gave my bicycle to an American aviator, and he gave money for his bicycle he provided an invader. And the bicycle was a very important way of escaping as well.
No, definitely. James Coburn in The Great Escape cycled all the way to Spain, didn't he? Or did he catch a train first? I'm forgetting. Again, another question about the aircraft because this has come up before actually about the safety. From your experience in the archives, any comparable difference in the safety of a B-17 to B-24 in terms of what you found in the documentation?
Well, the B-24 was considered harder to fly and much more dangerous overall. But as far as getting out of them, I never found any great comparison. Once there's a bell that meant the pilot could ring, meant to evacuate, but often it had been damaged too, so the verbal came. And of course, a lot of times the B-24s were more active with the 15th Air Force into the Pelosi airfields and those places where there wasn't much chance, even if you got out of the plane. They were so concentrated of an area. I would say the 17 was a little easier, but I did not find any definite statistics on it.
Brilliant stuff. And Andreas, who's in Germany, is mentioning the fact that, of course, we haven't specifically talked about the difference between jumping out over Germany and jumping out over the France and Netherlands and Belgium, because you're talking about occupied countries or actually the center of the Third Reich. So if your mission is taking you over to Germany, then presumably you're not to go up to any kind of house and knock on the door. Is that what different briefings were given if you're expected to be flying a long time over Germany?
Generally, the ones that did escape that were from German missions, the planes were able to limp back over into Belgium,
right,
or northern France. There was, towards the very end of the war, I found a couple of stories about downed airmen in Germany that went to German houses that were fed and pointed down the road. The Germans were tired of it too.
I mean, and Gary, thank you. Gary is asking about the survival rate of those helping the Allied aviators. Well, that's a massive, great rabbit hole and deserving of its own subject, because we talked about it. These various lines, Comet Line and whatever, they were broken and then set up again. And I mean, it was a very, very dangerous occupation. If you were a French, Belgian, or Dutch person helping out on these, I don't know what the chances of survival were, but there are many, many cases of these lines being broken. And as you said there, Lee, the fact that Gestapo and others are trying to break them. So actually, that's a good question to ask. You talked about when these 8th Air Force pilots, maybe they've got back from Gibraltar and Spain, they've got back to England, and what happened? Let's say they've been on the ground 3 months in France before they get back. Well, in that time, the squadron that they left might have had a turnover of personnel. There might be barely anybody left in the squadron who knows that guy. So let's say there's a problem and no one quite can verify who Fred is. They've got this airman there. Did the Germans ever try and put anybody in? As far as we know, did they ever try and send anybody in who was a stooge or a decoy or a spy? Or was it just a suspicion we had that was never actually needed to be used?
The Germans did have people jump from planes in over France in American uniforms to try to break up the lines, but there's no records of any of them actually trying to get back to London and penetrate the MIs as well. The overall look at what they were doing was, we got to remember that today we've got this man out. Instead of staying on that, we've got to try to get the next man out. It was very rapid, very fluid situations. Now, as far as the total numbers of helpers, there were a great deal, like there were some leaders of the lines that were the number one guys. If you helped for a certain distance, you were rewarded at the end of the war. If you provided, like the person with a bicycle, or maybe you just stopped by one house and they fed you a meal and pointed you down the road, they still gave you some reparations. I include in the book the rules that were used to repay these people in Holland. It was the same in the other places as well. And you just flashed on the screen.
Yeah, I just realized we hadn't talked about the winged boots. That'd be a good way to end the show. So tell us about this.
Another thing we stole from the new people. It was originated with the RAF, and it was, of course, not an official decoration. But what they did in the uniform, inside the lapel, they wore it. And then if you ran into somebody you thought was the same, you'd flash your ring boot, and then you knew you were in the same brotherhood. There were several other symbols that were made up from the same item. By the way, there was an American organization that met about 10 years after the war and met till about 10 years ago, an annual reunion. Now there's so few of them alive that it's no longer known.
Well, thanks for mentioning the winged boot. So to round things off, for those who are watching today, and I'm recommending books week in, week out on this channel, this book, to me, seems to cover various aspects. It's got your escape and evasion, it's got some aircraft details, and it's got some archival information there. So what obviously it's been out for a while. It's not brand new, the book, but sell it to the audience. What it covers obviously the Blister Club, but what would be your sales pitch if you want to try and get it made into a movie?
It's a great human story about cooperations between people and the will to survive. And it's a very interesting aspect of everybody knows that people flew over. Everybody knows people got shot down, but very few people know about some of them escaped after they got shot down. And I think anybody looking for that look that's interested in World War II aviation or just the human experience will find the book interesting.
No, I agree, and I think as I said at the beginning, it's this idea that there was organization behind it. Because as I say, the movies suggest that it's every individual thinking for themselves. But actually, as you explained, there's a structure behind this. There's organization. There's intelligence going into it. There's equipment that you're being issued, and there's information you're being given to facilitate your chance of getting it back home. Hence the 10% that got back. So we will bring things to the end of there. I'm just going to take you off screen for a second to remind people what we've got coming up tomorrow, and I'll bring you back in to say goodbye in a moment. So tomorrow, folks, we have a return guest, John Curatola from the New Orleans World War II Museum is joining us to talk about fighter development in World War II in terms of the 8th Air Force, so how it was worked with. It's going to cover drop tanks and escorting of bombers at altitudes, the formations, tactics. That'll be a cracking show. And then, as you've seen, the week goes on with various other subjects. We've got to look at a particular raid, the Mission 760. I've just scheduled a show with my old friend Clive Stevens in the UK, who's talking about the 8th Air Force kind of winding down the last few weeks of the war into 45, and indeed the closing down of the bases in 1945 or sometimes as late as 1946. That one's on Saturday. And then next week, I haven't started putting shows up yet, but that'll be a kind of random combat week. Robbie Maguire from the Fighting on Film and RM Military Channel is going to be a guest that week. But before I sign out and say goodbye to Lee, do remember to click subscribe if you haven't already. The information you need is in the description below. And if you would consider becoming a patron or a YouTube channel member, it's greatly appreciated. But I'll bring Lee back in to say thank you very much. So Thanks very much, Lee. Good luck, and I will see you again, perhaps with your next subject. You've said it's on Eisenhower now, and the world can't have enough Eisenhower biographies. For me, for my money, he has always remained kind of top of my list of World War II heroes. Other people go up and down in my estimation, but Eisenhower stays right at the top. So I look forward to inviting you back to talk about Eisenhower, if you'd be up for that when the book is out.
Now, what's interesting about the book I'm working on Eisenhower is not what he did in World War II. It's how he became Eisenhower. How he went from security, was a major for 15 years, and then had a promotion every 6 months for 3 years until he was Supreme Allied Commander. In between the Blister Club and the Eisenhower book, it just came out as a book titled Patton in Mexico. And of course, Patton is well known for World War II, but few people realize that he was a lieutenant when the United States went into Mexico chasing the bandit Pancho Villa in 1916. And that is where Patton really learned to be Patton. He shot his first enemy with his ivory-handled pistol. He learned about mechanized vehicles by driving trucks and vehicles. So there's a Patton story there as well. So I guess I'm looking more towards World War II, where I earned my spurs writing about Vietnam, but I think I've written about that all of it too.
Well, that's good. Well, Lee, it's been great talking to you. So this is Paul Woodhouse for World War II TV saying I will see you all again tomorrow. Thank you everybody for watching, and thank you everybody for your great comments. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Goodbye.